The storm that ravaged Magnolia Grove Plantation on the night of March 15, 1862, would be remembered not for the trees it felled or the crops it destroyed, but for what emerged from the slave quarters as lightning split the Louisiana sky. In a cramped cabin that reeked of sweat, fear, and impending death, a woman named Sarah clutched the rough wooden planks of her bed, her screams lost beneath the thunder's roar. Master Cornelius Whitmore had purchased Sarah 3 years prior at the New Orleans slave market, drawn not by her strength, though she was sturdy enough, but by her breeding potential. At 19, she had already borne 2 children, both sold before their second birthdays. Now, as Confederate cannons echoed in the distance and the Union blockade strangled the South's economy, every slave birth represented both hope and burden for the struggling plantation. The midwife, an elderly slave named Mama Celia, had delivered dozens of babies in her 63 years. Her weathered hands had guided new life into a world of bondage, had closed the eyes of infants too weak to survive their first winter, and had comforted mothers whose children were torn from their arms by the auction block. But as she knelt between Sarah's trembling legs that night, something felt different, wrong in a way that made her ancient bones ache with premonition. "Push, child," Mama Celia whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "This baby wants to come into the world." Sarah's body convulsed with another contraction, her fingernails digging crescents into the wooden bed frame. The cabin's single candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls where other slave women huddled, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. Outside, the wind howled like the voices of the damned, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl, a long, mournful sound that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. The birth progressed with unusual speed. Where most labors in the quarters stretched through the night and into the following day, this child seemed eager to emerge. As Sarah's final push sent waves of agony through her body, the candle flame suddenly blazed higher, illuminating the cabin in stark detail. And then, in a moment that would haunt Mama Celia for the remainder of her days, the baby slipped into the world. Silence. No cry, no wail. No sharp intake of breath that announced a new soul's arrival. The infant, a girl, Mama Celia noted with practiced efficiency, lay perfectly still in her hands, her skin pale as moonlight despite her mother's dark complexion. Her eyes were open, staring with an intensity that seemed impossible for a newborn, and her tiny lips were curved in what could only be described as a smile. "Why ain't she crying?" Sarah gasped, struggling to lift her head. "Mama Celia, why ain't my baby crying?" The old midwife's hands trembled as she held the child. In all her years, she had never encountered a baby who emerged so silently, so aware. The infant's eyes, a startling shade of amber that seemed to glow in the candlelight, tracked movement with an intelligence that chilled Mama Celia to her core. She's breathing, Mama Celia managed, though her voice carried no conviction. Sometimes babies don't cry right away. But even as she spoke, the old woman knew this was no ordinary delay. The child's chest rose and fell with perfect rhythm. Her tiny fingers flexed with purpose, and those unsettling amber eyes continued their silent observation of the world around her. It was as if she had been born already knowing secrets that others spent lifetimes trying to understand. Sarah reached for her daughter with shaking arms. "Give her to me. Let me hold my baby." As Mama Celia placed the infant against Sarah's chest, the strangest thing happened. The child's first breath, a deep, satisfied inhalation, seemed to draw something from the very air itself. The candle flame dimmed, the shadows deepened, and from somewhere beneath the cabin's floorboards came a series of soft thuds, like small bodies hitting the ground. "What was that?" whispered Beulah, one of the younger women who had been assisting with the birth. Mama Celia's blood ran cold. She had heard that sound before, years ago, when poison had been spread in the barn to deal with a rat infestation. It was the sound of creatures dying, quickly, quietly, and without struggle. The baby, whom Sarah would name Eliza after her own grandmother, turned her head toward the sound, and her tiny smile widened. For just a moment, in the flickering candlelight, her amber eyes seemed to flash with something that looked disturbingly like pleasure. "Mama Celia." Sarah's voice was growing weak from exhaustion and blood loss. "Something's wrong. I can feel it. There's something wrong with my baby." The old midwife wanted to offer comfort, to speak the soothing words she had whispered to countless new mothers over the decades. But as she looked down at the infant, at Eliza, she found herself unable to lie. The child was beautiful, perfectly formed, and undeniably healthy. Yet there was something in her presence that made the air itself feel heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere had been poisoned by her arrival. "She's perfect," Mama Celia said finally, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "You rest now, Sarah. You've done good." But Sarah's eyes remained fixed on her daughter's face, studying the features that seemed too mature, too knowing for a newborn. "Look at her eyes, Mama Celia. Look how she watches everything. It's like she understands." "Babies see things we don't," the midwife replied, though she herself was disturbed by the child's unwavering gaze. "She'll be fine. You both will." As the storm began to subside outside, the women in the cabin gradually dispersed, returning to their own quarters with whispered conversations and backward glances. But Mama Celia remained, ostensibly to monitor Sarah and the baby through the crucial first hours, but in reality because she was afraid to leave them alone. The old woman had delivered babies who died within hours, babies born with deformities that marked them as cursed, babies whose mothers hemorrhaged and followed them into death. She had seen the full spectrum of birth's possibilities, from miraculous to tragic. But she had never encountered a child whose very presence seemed to alter the world around her. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Mama Celia dozed fitfully in her chair beside Sarah's bed. She was awakened by a sound that made her heart race, Sarah's sharp intake of breath, followed by a whispered prayer. "Lord, have mercy," Sarah breathed, staring down at her daughter. "Mama Celia, look." The old woman leaned forward, and what she saw made her cross herself instinctively. During the night, while they had slept, someone, or something, had arranged a perfect circle of dead rats around the cabin. Dozens of them, their small bodies positioned with mathematical precision, their eyes open and staring inward toward the building where Eliza lay, sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "Did you hear anything?" Mama Celia whispered. "Any sounds during the night?" Sarah shook her head, her face pale with fear. "Nothing, just her breathing. She breathes so deep, like she's trying to pull in more than just air." The midwife approached the cabin's single window and peered out at the macabre display. The rats showed no signs of violence, no wounds or trauma that might explain their deaths. They simply lay there, arranged in their perfect circle, as if they had willingly given their lives in some sort of offering. "We need to tell Master Whitmore," Beulah said from the doorway, where she had appeared to check on the new mother and child. "No," Mama Celia said sharply. "We don't tell the Master nothing about this. You understand me? Nothing." The younger woman's eyes widened. "But Mama Celia, this ain't natural. That baby is Sarah's child, and she's under our protection," the old midwife interrupted. "Whatever happened here, we keep it between us. The Master's got enough troubles with the war and the crops failing. He don't need to be worrying about dead rats." But even as she spoke, Mama Celia knew that the circle of death outside was only the beginning. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs of something beyond human understanding, something that defied the natural order. And as she watched Eliza sleep, so peacefully, so contentedly, she couldn't shake the feeling that the child was somehow feeding on the death that surrounded her. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of the storm clouds, but the oppressive feeling in the cabin remained. Other slaves began to emerge from their quarters, preparing for another day of back-breaking labor under the increasingly erratic supervision of Master Whitmore and his overseers. But they gave Sarah's cabin a wide berth, their instincts warning them away from whatever had transpired during the night. As the day progressed, word of the strange birth began to spread through the slave quarters in whispers and sideways glances. The story grew with each telling: the baby who didn't cry, the circle of dead rats, the feeling of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the cabin itself. Some of the older slaves crossed themselves and muttered prayers in languages half remembered from their African ancestors. Others simply avoided the area altogether, as if proximity to the child might somehow contaminate them. Master Whitmore, preoccupied with reports of Union forces moving closer to the plantation and the ongoing struggle to maintain his dwindling workforce, paid little attention to the gossip from the quarters. His wife, Constance, had taken to her bed with one of her frequent nervous conditions, leaving the day-to-day management of the slaves to the overseers, men whose primary concerns were productivity and discipline, not the superstitious fears of their charges. But Mama Celia watched and waited and tried to ignore the growing certainty that Eliza was not like other children, that she never would be. As evening approached and the plantation settled into its nightly routine, the old midwife made her way back to Sarah's cabin. She found the new mother sitting up in bed, nursing her daughter with an expression of profound unease. "She don't nurse like other babies," Sarah said without preamble. "She don't seem hungry, but she latches on anyway, like she's taking something else." Mama Celia nodded grimly. She had noticed it too, the way Eliza seemed to draw strength, not just from her mother's milk, but from something deeper, something that left Sarah looking increasingly pale and drained. "How you feeling, child?" the midwife asked, though she already knew the answer. "Tired," Sarah admitted. "More tired than I should be, and cold. Even with the fire burning, I can't seem to get warm." The old woman placed a weathered hand on Sarah's forehead. Her skin was cool to the touch, despite the warmth of the evening, and there was a greyish pallor to her complexion that spoke of something being slowly drained away. "You need to eat," Mama Celia said, though she suspected food would do little to address Sarah's condition. "Build your strength back up." But as she spoke, Eliza detached from her mother's breast and turned those unsettling amber eyes toward the midwife. For a moment, the two stared at each other, the ancient woman who had seen too much and the infant who seemed to understand far more than she should. And in that moment, Mama Celia felt something cold and hungry brush against her soul, like invisible fingers testing her defenses. The baby smiled. Outside, as if summoned by some silent call, more rats began to emerge from their hiding places. They moved with purpose, arranging themselves in ever-widening circles around the cabin, their small bodies trembling with an ecstasy that preceded death. And in the growing darkness, other creatures began to gather, birds that fell from the sky mid-flight, insects that crawled from their nests only to expire in perfect formations, even a stray dog that wandered into the plantation and collapsed at the cabin's threshold, its tail still wagging as life left its eyes. Eliza's smile widened, and for the first time since her birth, she made a sound, not a cry, but a soft, contented sigh that seemed to carry on the wind long after her tiny lungs had expelled it. The night was young, and already the death toll was mounting. 3 months had passed since Eliza's birth, and the slave quarters of Magnolia Grove had settled into an uneasy rhythm around the strange child. Summer had arrived with its typical Louisiana brutality, a suffocating blanket of heat and humidity that turned the simplest tasks into ordeals of endurance. The cotton fields shimmered under the merciless sun, and the air hung thick with the promise of thunderstorms that never seemed to come. It was during this season of suffering that Eliza's true nature began to reveal itself in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or superstition. The first sign came when the fever swept through the quarters like wildfire. It started with little Moses, a boy of 6, whose mother worked in the big house kitchen. One morning, he woke burning with temperature, his small body racked with chills despite the oppressive heat. By evening, 3 more children had fallen ill. By the end of the week, nearly every child under 10 was bedridden, their parents taking turns to care for them while still maintaining their grueling work schedules. Mama Celia moved between the cabins like a guardian angel, dispensing what remedies she could from her limited stores of herbs and folk medicine. She had seen such fevers before. They came with the summer heat and the poor conditions, claiming the weakest first and spreading through the close quarters like a plague. Usually, they took at least 2 or 3 children before burning themselves out, but Eliza remained untouched. While other infants her age lay listless and burning in their mother's arms, Eliza thrived. Her amber eyes grew brighter, her pale skin took on an almost luminous quality, and she began to reach developmental milestones with startling speed. At 3 months, she was already holding her head steady, tracking movement with predatory focus, and, most disturbing of all, smiling with what appeared to be genuine amusement whenever the sounds of suffering drifted from neighboring cabins. Sarah noticed it first. As she sat beside her daughter's makeshift crib, listening to the delirious cries of sick children echoing through the thin cabin walls, she observed how Eliza's breathing would deepen and slow, as if she was savoring something in the air that others couldn't detect. "She likes it," Sarah whispered to Mama Celia during one of the old woman's visits. "When the children cry, when they're in pain, she likes it." The midwife wanted to dismiss such talk as the paranoid imaginings of an exhausted new mother, but she had seen too much to ignore the evidence of her own eyes. There was indeed something unsettling about the way Eliza responded to suffering, a contentment that seemed to grow stronger as the fever claimed more victims. "Babies don't understand pain the way we do," Mama Celia said, though her words carried no conviction. She's just a baby, Sarah." But even as she spoke, the old woman's gaze fell on Eliza, who was watching her with those unnaturally intelligent amber eyes. The child's expression was serene, almost beatific, and there was something in her gaze that made Mama Celia feel as though she were being evaluated, measured for some purpose she couldn't comprehend. The fever continued its rampage through the quarters for 2 weeks. 7 children died, their small bodies buried in the plantation's slave cemetery under crude wooden markers. Their parents grieved in the brief moments between their endless labor, their tears mixing with sweat as they worked the fields under the overseer's watchful eye. And through it all, Eliza not only remained healthy, she flourished. By the time the fever finally broke, the infant had grown noticeably larger and stronger. Her hair, which had been sparse and colorless at birth, now grew in thick waves of an unusual silver blonde that seemed to catch and hold light in impossible ways. Her skin, already pale, took on an almost translucent quality that revealed the delicate network of veins beneath. And her eyes, those disturbing amber orbs, seemed to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with reflected light. The other slaves began to notice. They whispered among themselves when they thought Sarah couldn't hear, crossing themselves and muttering prayers in half-remembered languages. Some made excuses to avoid her cabin altogether, while others found reasons to walk past it, drawn by a morbid fascination they couldn't explain. "That child ain't natural," muttered old Tom, a field hand whose own grandson had been among the fever's victims. "Ain't right for a baby to grow fat while others waste away." "Hush your mouth!" snapped his wife, Bessie, though her own eyes held the same suspicion. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Tom's words echoed the thoughts of many in the quarters. There was something fundamentally wrong about a child who thrived in the midst of death and suffering, who seemed to draw strength from the very air that carried the sounds of pain and grief. The situation grew more disturbing as summer progressed. An outbreak of dysentery struck the adult population, leaving grown men and women doubled over with cramps and fever. The plantation's productivity plummeted as workers collapsed in the fields, too weak to continue their labor. Master Whitmore, already struggling with wartime shortages and the constant threat of Union forces, grew increasingly desperate and violent in his attempts to maintain order. It was during this period that the overseers began to take notice of the strange child in Sarah's cabin. James Crawford, the head overseer, was a man whose cruelty was legendary, even by the standards of antebellum Louisiana. A tall, gaunt figure with pale eyes and a perpetual sneer, he took pleasure in the suffering of those under his control. He had been watching the slave quarters with growing suspicion, noting how the sickness seemed to spread everywhere except to one particular cabin. "Mighty strange," he commented to his assistant, a younger man named Pike, who shared his taste for violence. "Every other pickaninny in the quarters is sick or dead, but that yellow gal's baby is fat as a tick." Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Maybe she's got some kind of protection. You know how these people are with their hoodoo nonsense." Crawford's eyes narrowed. He had dealt with slave rebellions before, had seen how superstition and folk magic could be used to undermine white authority. The idea that one of his charges might possess some form of supernatural protection was both intriguing and threatening. "I think it's time we paid a visit to Sarah's cabin," he said, his hand moving instinctively to the whip coiled at his belt. "See what kind of devilry she's been practicing." But before Crawford could act on his suspicions, another incident occurred that would shift the focus of the plantation's attention in an entirely different direction. It happened on a sweltering Tuesday morning as the slaves were being assembled for their daily work assignments. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, but already the air shimmered with heat waves that made the distant fields appear to dance and writhe like living things. The workers stood in ragged lines, their faces etched with exhaustion and resignation, waiting for the overseers to divide them into work gangs. Sarah stood among them, Eliza cradled in her arms. The baby had grown too large for the makeshift sling Sarah had fashioned, and carrying her while working was becoming increasingly difficult. But Master Whitmore had made it clear that new mothers were expected to return to fieldwork within weeks of giving birth, regardless of their circumstances. As Crawford began calling out work assignments, his gaze fell on Sarah and her child. Something about the baby's appearance struck him as odd. She was too alert, too aware of her surroundings for an infant her age. And there was something about her eyes that made him uncomfortable, a quality of attention that seemed almost predatory. "You there," he called, pointing his whip in Sarah's direction. "Bring that baby here." Sarah's blood ran cold. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that eventually the overseers would take notice of Eliza's unusual development. Clutching her daughter closer, she approached Crawford with reluctant steps. "Let me see the child," Crawford commanded, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Sarah hesitated, every maternal instinct screaming at her to protect her baby from this man's attention. But she knew that defiance would only make things worse for both of them. Reluctantly, she held Eliza out for Crawford's inspection. The overseer leaned forward, studying the infant's features with the same clinical detachment he might show when examining livestock. Eliza, for her part, stared back at him with those unsettling amber eyes, her tiny lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Mighty strange-looking baby," Crawford muttered. "Those eyes. Never seen eyes like that on a nigger child." As he spoke, he reached out with one finger to touch Eliza's cheek. The moment his skin made contact with hers, several things happened simultaneously. Crawford's face went white, his eyes rolling back to show only the whites. A sound escaped his throat, not quite a scream, but something far more disturbing, like the death rattle of a man drowning in his own blood. His body began to convulse, his limbs jerking spasmodically as if he were being electrocuted, and Eliza laughed. It was the first sound she had made since her birth, a clear musical laugh that seemed to ring out across the plantation like a bell. But there was nothing innocent about that sound. It carried undertones of malice and hunger that made every person within earshot feel as though something cold and slimy had crawled down their spine. Crawford collapsed to the ground, his body twitching and writhing in the dust. Foam bubbled from his lips, and his eyes, when they finally focused, held a look of absolute terror, as if he had seen something that had shattered his sanity. "Get away from her!" he screamed, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "Get that thing away from me!" The assembled slaves stood frozen in shock, unsure how to react to the sight of their tormentor reduced to a gibbering wreck. Pike rushed to Crawford's side, trying to help him to his feet, but the head overseer continued to thrash and scream, his gaze fixed on Eliza with undisguised horror. "She's not human!" Crawford babbled, spittle flying from his lips. "That thing, it's not human! I saw what it really is!" Sarah backed away, clutching Eliza protectively against her chest. The baby had stopped laughing, but her amber eyes continued to track Crawford's movements with what appeared to be amusement. And as Sarah watched in growing horror, she noticed that her daughter seemed somehow more solid, more present than before, as if Crawford's terror had fed her in some fundamental way. The incident sent shockwaves through the plantation hierarchy. Crawford, once the most feared man on Magnolia Grove, was reduced to a trembling wreck who refused to go anywhere near the slave quarters. He spent his days huddled in his cabin, drinking heavily and muttering about demons and unnatural things that wore the faces of children. Master Whitmore, already struggling with the pressures of war and economic hardship, found himself facing a crisis of authority. Without Crawford's iron-fisted control, discipline in the quarters began to break down. Slaves whispered among themselves about the strange baby who had brought down their oppressor with a single touch, and some began to speak of her in terms that bordered on reverence. But Mama Celia knew better. She had seen the look in Eliza's eyes during Crawford's breakdown, the cold satisfaction of a predator that had successfully brought down its prey. Whatever the child was, she was not a savior or a blessing. She was something far more dangerous. As night fell over Magnolia Grove, the old midwife made her way to Sarah's cabin with a heavy heart. She found the young mother sitting beside her daughter's crib, staring down at the sleeping infant with a mixture of love and fear. "She's changing," Sarah whispered without looking up. "Every day she's more like something else, something that just looks like my baby." Mama Celia nodded grimly. She had reached the same conclusion, though she had been reluctant to voice it. "What are you going to do?" Sarah's hands trembled as she reached down to stroke Eliza's silver blonde hair. "I don't know. She's my child, but I'm scared of her. I'm scared of what she might become." In her crib, Eliza stirred slightly, her amber eyes opening to fix on the two women with that unnaturally intelligent gaze. And for just a moment, in the flickering candlelight, her features seemed to shift and blur, revealing something underneath that was ancient, hungry, and utterly inhuman. The child who never fell ill smiled in her sleep, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl. Dr. Nathaniel Beauregard arrived at Magnolia Grove on a humid September morning, his black medical bag clutched in one hand, and a letter of introduction from Master Whitmore's cousin in New Orleans in the other. The war had been particularly unkind to medical professionals in Louisiana. Many had fled north or been conscripted into Confederate service, leaving the remaining practitioners to serve multiple plantations across increasingly dangerous territory. Beauregard was a man in his early 40s, with graying temples and the soft hands of someone who had spent his life in comfortable circumstances. He had studied medicine at Tulane University before the war, specializing in what he termed the peculiar medical challenges presented by the Negro Constitution. His theories about racial differences in disease susceptibility had earned him a modest reputation in New Orleans medical circles, though his colleagues often found his methods unorthodox and his conclusions questionable. The doctor's arrival had been prompted by Master Whitmore's growing concern about the health crisis plaguing his slave population. The fever and dysentery outbreaks had decimated his workforce, and the strange incident with Crawford had left the plantation's authority structure in shambles. Whitmore needed answers, and more importantly, he needed his slaves healthy enough to work. "Dr. Beauregard," Whitmore said, greeting the physician on the steps of the big house, "thank you for coming. I trust the journey from New Orleans wasn't too arduous." "Quite manageable, thank you," Beauregard replied, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Though I must say, the reports of Union activity in the area are rather concerning." Whitmore's face darkened. "The Yankees are the least of my worries at the moment. It's my own property that's causing me the greatest distress." As they walked toward the slave quarters, Whitmore explained the situation in detail: the recurring illnesses, the high mortality rate among the children, and the mysterious breakdown of his head overseer. He was careful to present the facts in purely medical terms, avoiding any mention of the supernatural explanations that had begun to circulate among his slaves. "Most peculiar," Beauregard mused, adjusting his spectacles as they approached the first row of cabins. "Fever and dysentery are common enough in these conditions, but the pattern you describe suggests something more complex. Perhaps a contaminated water source or some form of environmental toxin." The doctor's confidence was reassuring to Whitmore, who had begun to fear that his plantation was cursed. Here was a man of science, someone who could provide rational explanations for the inexplicable events that had been plaguing Magnolia Grove. Their first stop was the cabin where little Moses had died 3 months earlier. The boy's mother, a woman named Ruth, greeted them with the mixture of deference and suspicion that slaves typically showed to white visitors. Her surviving children, 2 girls aged 8 and 10, huddled behind her skirts, their eyes wide with fear. Beauregard examined the cabin with clinical detachment, noting the poor ventilation, the dirt floor, and the overcrowded conditions. He questioned Ruth about her son's symptoms, taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. "The fever came on sudden like," Ruth explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "One day, he was playing with the other children. The next, he was burning up and talking nonsense." "What sort of nonsense?" Beauregard asked, his pen poised over his journal. Ruth hesitated, glancing nervously at Master Whitmore. "He kept saying he could smell something sweet in the air. Said it made him want to follow it, like it was calling to him." The doctor frowned. Olfactory hallucinations were not uncommon in cases of high fever, but the specific nature of Moses's delusions struck him as unusual. "Did any of the other children report similar symptoms?" "Most of them," Ruth admitted. "They all talked about the sweet smell, about wanting to follow it, and they all—" She trailed off, unwilling to continue. "Yes?" Beauregard prompted. "They all died smiling," Ruth whispered. "Every last one of them died with smiles on their faces, like they was happy to go." Beauregard made another note, his scientific curiosity piqued. He had encountered various forms of delirium in his practice, but he had never heard of a fever that induced such consistent euphoric symptoms in its final stages. They continued their tour of the quarters, visiting the cabins where other children had died. In each case, the stories were remarkably similar: sudden onset of fever, olfactory hallucinations involving a sweet scent, and a peaceful, almost joyful death. The pattern was so consistent that Beauregard began to suspect some form of poisoning, though he couldn't imagine what toxin might produce such specific effects. It was, as they approached Sarah's cabin, that the doctor first became aware of something unusual in the air. At first, he attributed it to his imagination, a faint sweetness that seemed to hover at the edge of perception, like the scent of flowers just beginning to decay. But as they drew closer to the cabin, the smell grew stronger, more distinct. "Do you notice anything aromatic?" he asked Whitmore, who shook his head in confusion. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Doctor." Beauregard paused, testing the air with his nostrils. The scent was definitely there, cloying, almost narcotic in its intensity. It reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place what. Something from his medical training, perhaps, or from his childhood in New Orleans. "Never mind," he said, though he made a mental note to investigate further. Sarah emerged from her cabin as they approached, Eliza cradled in her arms. The baby had grown considerably since her birth 6 months earlier, and Beauregard was immediately struck by her unusual appearance. Her silver blonde hair caught the sunlight like spun metal, and her amber eyes seemed to track his movements with an intelligence that was remarkable for an infant her age. "This is Sarah," Whitmore explained. "She gave birth just before the fever outbreak began. Remarkably, her child has remained completely healthy throughout all our recent troubles." Beauregard studied Eliza with professional interest. The baby was indeed a fine specimen, well-nourished, alert, and showing signs of advanced development. But there was something about her that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "May I examine the child?" he asked Sarah, who nodded reluctantly. As Beauregard reached for Eliza, the sweet scent in the air suddenly intensified, becoming almost overwhelming. For a moment, his vision blurred, and he felt a strange sense of disorientation, as if the world around him had shifted slightly out of focus. The baby's skin was warm to the touch, not with fever, but with a vitality that seemed almost electric. As his fingers made contact with her tiny hand, Beauregard felt a jolt of sensation that was unlike anything in his medical experience. It was as if he had touched a live wire, but instead of pain, the sensation was oddly pleasurable, almost intoxicating. Eliza's amber eyes fixed on his face, and for a moment Beauregard felt as though he were falling into their depths. Images flashed through his mind, memories that weren't his own, visions of suffering and death that filled him with a perverse sense of satisfaction. He saw the children who had died in the fever outbreak, watched their final moments with a detachment that horrified him even as it thrilled him. "Doctor," Whitmore's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you quite all right?" Beauregard blinked, suddenly aware that he was swaying on his feet. The sweet scent had become so intense that it was difficult to breathe, and his heart was racing as if he had just run a great distance. "Yes, I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Just a momentary dizzy spell. The heat, you understand, but it wasn't the heat, and he knew it. Something had happened when he touched the child, something that defied rational explanation. The images he had seen, the sensations he had experienced, were unlike anything in his medical training or personal experience. As he stepped back from Sarah and her baby, Beauregard noticed that his hands were trembling. The sweet scent began to fade, but its effects lingered, a sense of euphoria mixed with an inexplicable craving for more of whatever he had just experienced. "The child appears to be in excellent health," he said, struggling to maintain his professional composure. Remarkably so, given the conditions, but even as he spoke, Beauregard's mind was racing. The baby's unusual appearance, the strange scent that seemed to emanate from her presence, the disturbing visions he had experienced. None of it fit with his understanding of normal human physiology. "Perhaps we should continue our examination elsewhere," he suggested, eager to put some distance between himself and the child. As they walked away from Sarah's cabin, Beauregard found himself glancing back repeatedly, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The baby's amber eyes seemed to follow him, and he could swear he saw her tiny lips curve in what might have been a smile. The rest of the day passed in a blur of examinations and interviews. Beauregard spoke with dozens of slaves, documenting their symptoms and searching for patterns that might explain the plantation's health crisis. But his mind kept returning to his encounter with Eliza, to the strange sensations and visions that had overwhelmed him. That evening, as he sat in the guest room Whitmore had provided, Beauregard attempted to make sense of his notes. The pattern of illness was clear enough. A fever that struck primarily children, accompanied by olfactory hallucinations and a peculiar euphoric delirium. But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the outbreak was connected to the strange child in Sarah's cabin. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The fever had begun shortly after Eliza's birth, and it had claimed every child in the quarters except her. Moreover, the symptoms described by the victims' families, the sweet scent, the euphoric delirium, were remarkably similar to what he had experienced when he touched the baby. Beauregard opened his medical bag and withdrew a small vial of laudanum. His hands were still trembling, and he found himself craving another encounter with whatever force had overwhelmed him in Sarah's cabin. The rational part of his mind recognized this as dangerous, but the craving was stronger than his scientific training. As he raised the vial to his lips, a sound from outside made him pause. It was faint at first, a soft musical laughter that seemed to drift on the night air. But as he listened more carefully, he realized it was coming from the direction of the slave quarters. Setting down the laudanum, Beauregard moved to his window and peered out into the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting the plantation in silver light, and he could see the dark shapes of the slave cabins in the distance. The laughter came again, clearer this time, and he recognized it as the sound a baby might make. But there was something wrong with that laughter, something that made his skin crawl, even as it filled him with an inexplicable longing. It was too knowing, too mature for an infant. And underneath its musical quality, he could detect something else, a hunger that seemed to reach across the distance between them and wrap itself around his soul. Beauregard found himself moving toward the door, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist. The sweet scent from earlier had returned, faint but unmistakable, and with it came the same euphoric sensations he had experienced during his examination of the child. He was halfway across the room when reason finally reasserted itself. With tremendous effort, he forced himself to stop, to think about what he was doing. He was a man of science, a rational being who didn't believe in supernatural nonsense. Whatever was happening to him had to have a logical explanation. But as he stood there, fighting against the compulsion to seek out the source of that terrible laughter, Beauregard couldn't shake the feeling that he had encountered something beyond the scope of medical science. Something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The laughter faded, leaving only the normal sounds of the Louisiana night. But the sweet scent lingered, and with it, the memory of amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Dr. Nathaniel Beauregard, man of science and reason, spent the rest of the night huddled in his room, afraid to venture outside, and equally afraid to remain where he was. And in the distance, in a cabin that reeked of death and unnatural life, a 6-month-old baby smiled in her sleep and dreamed of the feast to come. The iron scent of blood was already beginning to gather in the air, though it would be hours before anyone else would notice it. But Eliza could smell it, could taste it on the wind like a promise of things to come. And in her dreams, she reached out with invisible hands to touch the mind of the doctor who had dared to examine her, planting seeds of obsession that would soon bloom into madness. The night was still young, and there was so much more to come. The morning of October 12, 1862, dawned grey and oppressive over Magnolia Grove, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the violence to come. Master Cornelius Whitmore stood on the veranda of his plantation house, surveying his domain with the calculating gaze of a man whose world was slowly crumbling around him. The war had taken its toll. His eldest son had died at Shiloh. His cotton crops were rotting in the fields due to the Union blockade, and his slave population was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The incident with Dr. Beauregard 3 weeks earlier had only added to his troubles. The physician had fled the plantation in the middle of the night, leaving behind a hastily scrawled note claiming urgent business in New Orleans. but the servants who had cleaned his room reported finding it in a state of complete disarray, with furniture overturned and strange symbols scratched into the wooden walls. Symbols that looked disturbingly like the marks a man might make while clawing at the walls in terror. Whitmore had tried to dismiss the doctor's sudden departure as the eccentricity of an educated man unused to plantation life. But the truth was that Beauregard's behavior had been increasingly erratic during his brief stay. The man had been found wandering the grounds at night, muttering to himself about sweet scents and amber eyes. On his final morning, he had appeared at breakfast with deep scratches on his arms and a wild look in his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. Now, as Whitmore watched his remaining slaves moving listlessly through their morning routines, he felt the familiar rage building in his chest. These people, his property, were becoming increasingly insubordinate. They whispered among themselves in languages he didn't understand. They avoided certain areas of the quarters without explanation. And worst of all, their productivity had dropped to levels that threatened the plantation's survival. Something had to be done. Order had to be restored. The master's attention was drawn to a commotion near the slave cabins, where a group of field hands had gathered around something on the ground. From his vantage point on the veranda, Whitmore could see them pointing and gesturing, their voices carrying across the distance in an agitated buzz. "Pike!" he called to his remaining overseer, a nervous young man who had assumed Crawford's duties after the former head overseer's breakdown. "What's that disturbance in the quarters?" Pike hurried over, his face pale with the perpetual anxiety that had plagued him since Crawford's incident. "I'm not sure, Master Whitmore. Looks like they found something." "Well, go find out what it is," Whitmore snapped, "and if they're shirking their duties, you know what to do." As Pike jogged toward the slave quarters, Whitmore's gaze fell on Sarah's cabin, where the young woman could be seen hanging laundry on a makeshift line. Her baby, now 8 months old, sat in the dirt nearby, playing with what appeared to be small bones arranged in intricate patterns. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about the child's focused concentration as she manipulated the objects with her tiny fingers. The sight of Eliza always made Whitmore uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite articulate why. There was something about her appearance, the unnaturally pale skin, the silver blonde hair, the amber eyes that seemed to track movement with predatory intensity, that didn't sit right with him. She looked nothing like her mother, and certainly nothing like any slave child he had ever seen. Pike returned from the quarters at a run, his face even paler than before. "Master Whitmore," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You need to see this." "Yatta, what is it now?" Whitmore demanded, though something in Pike's expression made his stomach clench with apprehension. It's hard to explain, sir. You really need to see it for yourself." Whitmore followed Pike toward the slave quarters, his irritation growing with each step. He had neither the time nor the patience for whatever superstitious nonsense had captured his slaves' attention. But as they approached the gathered crowd, he began to understand Pike's distress. The slaves had discovered a perfect circle of dead animals arranged around Sarah's cabin, dozens of them, from rats and birds to larger creatures like raccoons and even a young deer. The animals showed no signs of violence or disease. They simply lay there as if they had chosen to die in that exact spot. Their eyes were open, staring inward toward the cabin where Eliza played with her bone toys, and their faces bore expressions of what could only be described as bliss. "How long have they been there?" Whitmore asked, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Must have happened during the night," Pike replied. "The slaves say they weren't there yesterday evening." Whitmore studied the macabre display, his mind struggling to find a rational explanation. The arrangement was too precise to be natural, too deliberate to be coincidental, and the sheer number of animals involved suggested something beyond normal predation or disease. "Clear this away," he ordered, his voice regaining some of its authority. "Burn the carcasses and get these people back to work." But even as he spoke, Whitmore's gaze was drawn to the cabin at the center of the death circle. Through the open doorway, he could see Sarah moving about her daily tasks, seemingly oblivious to the carnage that surrounded her home. And sitting in the dirt outside, Eliza continued her strange play, her amber eyes occasionally flicking toward the dead animals with what appeared to be satisfaction. The master's unease deepened as he noticed something else, the way his slaves were looking at the child. There was fear in their expressions, yes, but also something that looked disturbingly like reverence. They whispered among themselves in hushed tones, making gestures that Whitmore recognized as protective charms from their African heritage. "Get back to work," he shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the morning air. "All of you! Anyone caught loitering will feel the lash." The slaves dispersed quickly, but Whitmore could see them casting backward glances at Sarah's cabin as they went. The fear in their eyes was real, but so was something else. A growing sense that the strange child in their midst possessed power beyond their understanding. As the day progressed, Whitmore found himself unable to concentrate on his usual duties. The image of the dead animals haunted him, as did the memory of Eliza's knowing gaze. He had dealt with slave superstitions before. Their belief in conjure and root work was well documented, but this felt different. This felt real. By afternoon, his anxiety had transformed into anger. Anger at his slaves for their insubordination, anger at the war for destroying his way of life, and most of all, anger at the strange child who seemed to be at the center of all his troubles. Something had to be done to restore order, to remind his property who was in control. The opportunity came when he observed Sarah leaving her cabin to fetch water from the well, leaving Eliza unattended. The baby sat in her usual spot, surrounded by her collection of bones and other small objects that she arranged and rearranged with disturbing precision. Whitmore approached the cabin with purposeful strides, his anger building with each step. He had owned slaves for over 20 years, had bought and sold hundreds of human beings like livestock. He would not be intimidated by superstitious nonsense surrounding one peculiar child. "Sarah," he called out as the young woman returned with her water bucket. "Come here now." Sarah hurried over, her face etched with the automatic fear that all slaves learn to display in the presence of their masters. "Yes, Master Whitmore, this child of yours," he said, gesturing toward Eliza. "She's been causing problems. My slaves are distracted, productivity is down, and I'm tired of the disruption." "I don't understand, Master," Sarah replied, though her voice trembled with apprehension. "Eliza ain't done nothing wrong. She's just a baby." "Just a baby?" Whitmore's voice rose to a shout. "Just a baby doesn't cause circles of dead animals to appear overnight. Just a baby doesn't make grown men flee in terror. Just a baby doesn't turn my property into a collection of superstitious fools." As his anger reached its peak, Whitmore's hand moved instinctively to the whip coiled at his belt. He had used it countless times before to maintain discipline, to remind his slaves of their place in the natural order. The familiar weight of the braided leather in his hand was reassuring, a symbol of his absolute authority. "You've been practicing some kind of conjure," he accused, his eyes blazing with fury. "Using that child to work your hoodoo magic on my plantation. Well, I won't stand for it." "No, Master, please," Sarah begged, dropping to her knees. "I ain't done nothing. I don't know nothing about conjure." But Whitmore was beyond reason. The accumulated stress of months of inexplicable events, the humiliation of his overseer's breakdown, the fear that his authority was slipping away, all of it crystallized into a white-hot rage directed at the young woman kneeling before him. The whip uncoiled with a sharp crack, its leather tip biting into Sarah's back with practiced precision. She cried out in pain, her body arching as the braided leather tore through her thin dress and into the flesh beneath. "You'll tell me the truth," Whitmore snarled, raising the whip for another strike. "You'll tell me what kind of devil's work you've been practicing." The second blow landed across Sarah's shoulders, opening a gash that immediately began to bleed. The third struck her arms as she tried to protect herself. With each crack of the whip, Whitmore felt his control returning, his authority reasserting itself through the familiar ritual of violence. But as the beating continued, something changed in the air around them. The sweet scent that Dr. Beauregard had noticed began to gather, faint at first, but growing stronger with each drop of blood that fell to the ground. And from her position in the dirt nearby, Eliza began to laugh. It was the same musical sound that had haunted Beauregard's nights, but now it carried an undertone of pure malice that made Whitmore's blood run cold. The baby's amber eyes had taken on an inner glow, and her pale skin seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. "Stop!" Sarah gasped between blows. "Please, Master, look at her. Look at what you're doing to her." Whitmore paused, his whip raised for another strike, and followed Sarah's gaze to her daughter. What he saw there made his heart skip a beat. Eliza was no longer simply laughing, she was feeding. With each drop of her mother's blood that hit the ground, the child seemed to grow more solid, more present. Her skin took on a luminous quality that had nothing to do with reflected light, and her eyes blazed with an inner fire that spoke of ancient hungers finally being satisfied. "What?" Whitmore began, but the words died in his throat as Eliza turned her gaze toward him. In that moment, the master of Magnolia Grove saw something that shattered his understanding of the natural world. Behind the baby's amber eyes lurked an intelligence that was vast, ancient, and utterly inhuman. It was a consciousness that had existed long before the plantation, before the South, before human civilization itself. And it was hungry, so very, very hungry. The whip fell from Whitmore's nerveless fingers as visions flooded his mind. He saw the true nature of the thing that wore his slave's child's face, saw the web of death and suffering it had been weaving since its arrival at Magnolia Grove. The fever that had claimed the children, the circle of dead animals, the breakdown of his overseer, all of it had been orchestrated by this creature to feed its insatiable appetite for pain and terror. "No," he whispered, stumbling backward. "This isn't possible. This isn't real." But Eliza's laughter grew louder, more triumphant, and with it came a wave of sensation that drove Whitmore to his knees. He felt his sanity beginning to fray at the edges, felt his grip on reality loosening like sand through his fingers. The sweet scent in the air intensified until it was almost overwhelming, and Whitmore found himself breathing it in deeply despite his terror. With each inhalation, he felt something inside him changing, corrupting, as if the very air around the child was poisonous to human consciousness. Images flashed through his mind, memories of every cruel act he had ever committed, every life he had destroyed in the name of profit and control. But now those memories were tinged with a perverse pleasure that horrified him, even as it thrilled him. He saw his victims suffering through new eyes, felt their pain as if it were a drug coursing through his veins. "Stop!" he gasped, pressing his hands to his temples as the visions intensified. "Make it stop!" But Eliza's influence was growing stronger by the moment, fed by the blood that continued to seep from Sarah's wounds. The child's laughter echoed across the plantation grounds, and Whitmore could hear his remaining slaves crying out in terror as they felt the wave of malevolent energy washing over them. Sarah, despite her injuries, crawled toward her daughter with desperate determination. "Eliza, please," she whispered, her voice thick with pain and fear. "Please, baby, stop this." For a moment, the child's laughter faltered, and her glowing eyes turned toward her mother. In that brief instant, Whitmore caught a glimpse of something almost human in the creature's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even affection, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold hunger that seemed to define her existence. The master tried to stand, tried to flee from the nightmare that his simple act of discipline had unleashed, but his legs refused to obey him. The sweet scent had become so intense that it was difficult to think, difficult to remember who he was or why he was there. All that remained was the overwhelming sensation of pleasure mixed with terror, of ecstasy born from suffering. As the sun began to set over Magnolia Grove, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to echo the blood on the ground, Cornelius Whitmore felt his consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Eliza's amber eyes, glowing like twin stars in the gathering dusk, and her tiny lips curved in a smile that promised horrors beyond imagination. When the other slaves finally worked up the courage to investigate the silence that had fallen over Sarah's cabin, they found a scene that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Master Whitmore lay motionless in the dirt, his body unmarked, but his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky, and his mouth hung open as if he had died in the middle of a scream. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, her back still bleeding from the whip's kiss, but her injuries seemed almost insignificant compared to the change that had come over Eliza. The child had grown visibly larger during the confrontation, her features more defined, her presence more commanding. She sat surrounded by the bones she had been playing with earlier, but now they were arranged in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. "He's dead," whispered Mama Celia, who had been among the first to arrive. "Lord, have mercy, that child done killed the master." But as the old midwife spoke, Whitmore's chest rose and fell with a shallow breath. He was alive, but something fundamental had been taken from him, something that left him as empty and hollow as a discarded shell. The slaves stood in stunned silence, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. Their master, the man who had held absolute power over their lives, had been reduced to a broken husk by an 8-month-old baby. The natural order of their world had been shattered, leaving them adrift in a reality where the impossible had become mundane. As night fell over the plantation, Eliza's laughter rang out across the grounds one final time, a sound of pure triumph that seemed to promise that this was only the beginning. The child who had been born without crying had tasted power, had fed on suffering and terror until she was strong enough to reach out and touch the minds of those around her. And in the darkness that followed, as the slaves huddled in their cabins and tried to make sense of what they had seen, none of them noticed the new circle of dead animals that was already beginning to form around the place where their master lay broken and empty, his mind shattered by a glimpse of something that should not exist in the world of men. The sweet scent of corruption lingered in the air long after the screaming had stopped, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl, a long, mournful sound that seemed to mourn not just for the dead, but for the living who would never be the same again. Master Cornelius Whitmore would survive the night, but the man who had wielded the whip with such confidence would never return. In his place was something hollow and broken, a shell that breathed and moved, but no longer possessed the spark of human consciousness. He would spend his remaining days staring at nothing, his lips moving in silent conversation with horrors that only he could see. And Eliza would continue to grow, to learn, to hunger for more of the exquisite suffering that fed her unnatural existence. The plantation was hers now, in all but name, and the real feast was yet to begin. The autumn of 1862 brought with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of Magnolia Grove. Though the Louisiana climate remained as oppressive as ever, it was a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the presence that now dominated the plantation like a malignant tumor. In the 3 weeks since Master Whitmore's breakdown, the very atmosphere of the place had changed, becoming thick with an almost palpable sense of dread that made even the simplest tasks feel like acts of defiance against some unseen force. The master himself had become a hollow shell of his former self, spending his days sitting motionless on the veranda, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. His wife, Constance, had taken to her bed permanently, claiming nervous exhaustion, but really fleeing from a reality she could no longer comprehend. The plantation's day-to-day operations had effectively ceased, leaving the slaves in a strange limbo where they were neither free nor truly enslaved. It was Pike, the nervous young overseer, who finally made the decision that would seal Eliza's fate, at least temporarily. Unable to cope with the increasingly supernatural events plaguing the plantation, and terrified by the child's growing influence over both slaves and masters alike, he convinced the remaining household staff that something drastic had to be done. "That thing ain't natural," he whispered to Mrs. Henderson, the plantation's elderly housekeeper, as they huddled in the kitchen of the big house. "You've seen what it's done to Master Whitmore, what it did to Crawford. We can't let it roam free anymore." Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman who had served the Whitmore family for over 30 years, nodded grimly. She had witnessed the strange events of recent months with growing alarm, and while she didn't fully understand what they were dealing with, she knew it posed a threat to everything she held dear. "What do you propose we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Pike's eyes darted nervously toward the windows, as if he feared being overheard by unseen listeners. The root cellar beneath the big house, its solid stone built to last. "We lock her down there until we can figure out what to do next." The plan was simple in its desperation. They would wait until Sarah was away from her cabin she had taken to working in the fields again, carrying Eliza with her in a makeshift sling, and then they would take the child. It was a violation of every protocol that governed plantation life, but these were extraordinary circumstances that called for extraordinary measures. The opportunity came on a grey October morning when Sarah was assigned to help with the cotton harvest in the far fields. The work was backbreaking and required her full attention, forcing her to leave Eliza in the cabin under the watchful eye of an elderly slave woman named Aunt Dinah. Pike approached the cabin with 3 of the house servants, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Through the open doorway, he could see Eliza sitting in her usual spot, surrounded by the bones and small objects that had become her constant companions. At 10 months old, she had grown larger and more developed than any child her age had a right to be, and her amber eyes tracked their approach with an intelligence that made Pike's skin crawl. "Aunt Dinah," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson needs you in the big house. Something about preparing for visitors." The elderly woman emerged from the cabin, her face creased with confusion. "Visitors? Ain't nobody been visiting since the trouble started. Just go," Pike said more sharply than he intended, "and don't mention this to Sarah when she returns." Aunt Dinah hesitated, her instincts warning her that something was wrong. But years of conditioning made it impossible for her to directly disobey a white man's orders. With a worried glance back at the cabin, she hurried toward the big house. Pike waited until she was out of sight before nodding to his companions. "Remember," he whispered, "don't look directly into her eyes, and whatever you do, don't let her touch you." They entered the cabin like men approaching a wild animal's den, their movements careful and deliberate. Eliza watched them with apparent amusement, her tiny lips curved in that unsettling smile that had become her trademark. She made no attempt to flee or hide, seeming almost curious about their intentions. "Easy now," Pike murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Just pick her up and carry her out. Quick and simple." But as he reached for the child, Eliza's smile widened, and the sweet scent that had become associated with her presence suddenly intensified. Pike felt his vision blur, felt the familiar wave of euphoric disorientation that seemed to accompany any close contact with the strange infant. "Don't breathe it in," he gasped, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve. "Whatever you do, don't breathe it in." One of the house servants, a young man named Thomas, had already succumbed to the scent's influence. His eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality, and he was swaying on his feet as if drunk. "She's beautiful," he whispered, reaching toward Eliza with trembling fingers. "So beautiful." "Thomas, no!" Pike grabbed the young man's arm, pulling him back from the child. "Fight it! Don't let her get into your head!" But it was too late. Thomas had already fallen under Eliza's influence, and his face bore the same expression of blissful surrender that Pike had seen on the faces of the dead animals that periodically appeared around the plantation. With a strength born of desperation, Pike struck Thomas across the face, the sharp crack of the blow cutting through the supernatural haze that had settled over the cabin. Thomas blinked, his eyes clearing slightly, but the damage had been done. Eliza's laughter filled the air, that musical, terrible sound that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. And with her laughter came a wave of malevolent energy that made the cabin's walls seem to pulse like a living heart. "Grab her now!" Pike shouted, lunging forward before his courage could fail him entirely. His hands closed around Eliza's small body, and immediately he felt the same electric shock that Dr. Beauregard had experienced weeks earlier. But Pike was prepared for it, had steeled himself against the creature's influence through sheer force of will. Gritting his teeth against the waves of sensation that threatened to overwhelm him, he lifted the child and carried her from the cabin. Eliza's laughter grew louder, more triumphant, as if she were enjoying this new development. Her amber eyes blazed with inner fire, and her pale skin seemed to glow with an otherworldly light that had nothing to do with the overcast sky above. The journey to the big house felt like an eternity. With each step, Pike felt his strength ebbing away, drained by the creature in his arms. The sweet scent that surrounded her was so intense that it was difficult to think, difficult to remember why he was doing this. But he pressed on, driven by a desperate need to protect what remained of the world he understood. The root cellar beneath the big house was exactly as Pike had described, a stone chamber built to store food through the hot Louisiana summers. It was cool, dark, and most importantly, secure. The heavy wooden door was reinforced with iron bands, and the lock was solid enough to contain anything short of a full-grown man with tools. "Put her down there," Mrs. Henderson directed, her voice tight with fear as she watched Pike descend the stone steps with his supernatural burden. The cellar was perhaps 8 feet square, with walls of fitted stone that wept moisture in the humid climate. It smelled of earth and decay, of vegetables left too long in storage. But as Pike set Eliza down on the stone floor, the space began to change. The sweet scent of her presence mingled with the cellar's mustiness, creating an atmosphere that was both cloying and oppressive. Eliza looked around her new prison with apparent interest, her amber eyes taking in every detail of the stone walls and earthen floor. She showed no signs of distress or fear, seeming almost pleased by this turn of events. As Pike backed toward the stairs, she settled herself comfortably on the floor and began arranging small pebbles and bits of debris in the same intricate patterns she had favored in her mother's cabin. "Lock it," Pike gasped as he emerged from the cellar. "Lock it and pray to God that it holds." Mrs. Henderson turned the heavy key with trembling fingers, the metallic click echoing through the big house like a death knell. But even as the lock engaged, they could hear Eliza's laughter drifting up from below, a sound that seemed to mock their efforts at containment. "What have we done?" Thomas whispered, his face still pale from his encounter with the child's influence. "What if Sarah finds out? What if the other slaves—" "They won't," Pike said with more confidence than he felt. "We tell them the child took sick and died. We bury an empty coffin if we have to, whatever it takes to keep this quiet." But even as he spoke, Pike knew that their deception wouldn't last long. Sarah would demand to see her daughter's body, would insist on proper burial rites. And the other slaves, already suspicious of the supernatural events plaguing the plantation, would sense that something was wrong. The first sign that their plan was failing came that very evening as the household staff gathered for their evening meal. The sweet scent that had become associated with Eliza's presence began to seep up through the floorboards, growing stronger with each passing hour. By midnight, It had become so intense that several of the servants complained of headaches and nausea. "It's getting stronger," Mrs. Henderson observed, her face drawn with worry. "Whatever that thing is doing down there, it's not being contained by stone walls." Pike nodded grimly. He had hoped that physical confinement would limit the creature's influence, but it seemed that Eliza's power transcended such mundane barriers. If anything, being trapped seemed to have focused her malevolent energy, concentrating it like sunlight through a magnifying glass. The second sign came with the dawn, when the household staff discovered that every plant in Mrs. Henderson's carefully tended garden had withered and died during the night. The flowers, vegetables, and herbs that had flourished for years under her care now lay blackened and twisted, as if they'd been touched by some invisible blight. "It's spreading," Thomas whispered, staring at the devastation with horrified fascination. "Whatever she's doing down there, it's killing everything around her." But the most disturbing development came when Sarah returned from the fields that evening, expecting to find her daughter waiting in their cabin. Aunt Dinah, who had been instructed to tell the young mother that Eliza had been taken to the big house for medical attention, found herself unable to speak the lie. "Where is she?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising with panic as she searched the empty cabin. "Where's my baby?" They took her," Aunt Dinah stammered, her loyalty to her fellow slaves overriding her fear of white authority. "That overseer and his men, they came and took her while you was in the fields." Sarah's scream of anguish echoed across the plantation grounds, a sound of pure maternal grief that seemed to pierce the very air. But as her cry faded, it was answered by another sound, Eliza's laughter, drifting up from the depths of the big house cellar like an echo from hell itself. The child's response to her mother's distress was not one of answering grief, but of apparent amusement. It was as if Sarah's pain was a delicacy to be savored, a fine wine to be appreciated for its complexity and depth. Within hours, every slave on the plantation knew what had happened. The story spread through the quarters like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said the white folks had finally recognized the child's supernatural nature and were trying to destroy her. Others claimed that Eliza had allowed herself to be captured as part of some larger plan. But all agreed on one thing: the child in the cellar was no ordinary infant, and her imprisonment would not last long. As night fell over Magnolia Grove, the sweet scent emanating from the big house grew so intense that it could be detected from the slave quarters nearly a quarter-mile away, and with it came other signs of the creature's growing power. Strange lights flickering in the cellar windows, sounds that might have been singing or might have been screaming, and a sense of malevolent presence that seemed to press down on the plantation like a physical weight. In her stone prison, Eliza continued her patient work, arranging and rearranging the small objects she had found in the cellar's corners. But now her patterns were larger, more complex, covering nearly the entire floor in geometric designs that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The child who had been born without crying was learning, growing, adapting to her new circumstances. And as she worked, she hummed a tune that had no earthly origin, a melody that seemed to resonate in the very stones of her prison, calling out to things that dwelt in the spaces between spaces, in the dark corners where reality grew thin. The real horror was yet to come. The letter arrived at Magnolia Grove on a rain-soaked November morning, carried by a Confederate courier whose horse had nearly collapsed from exhaustion. The envelope bore the seal of the Diocese of New Orleans, and its contents would prove to be both salvation and damnation for the troubled plantation. Mrs. Henderson received the correspondence with trembling hands, her nerves frayed by weeks of supernatural torment. The sweet scent emanating from the cellar had grown so intense that it was now detectable throughout the big house, and several of the remaining servants had begun experiencing vivid nightmares filled with amber eyes and musical laughter. The letter was addressed to Master Whitmore, but since his breakdown, all plantation correspondence had fallen to the housekeeper's attention. She broke the wax seal with careful fingers and unfolded the heavy paper, her eyes scanning the elegant script within. "My dear Cornelius," the letter began, "I have received word through mutual acquaintances of the unusual difficulties plaguing your plantation. While I cannot claim to understand the full nature of these troubles, I am compelled by Christian duty to offer what assistance I can. I am dispatching Father Francois Dubois, a priest of considerable experience in matters of spiritual distress, to minister to your household and slaves. Father Dubois has served our Lord faithfully for over 20 years, including extensive missionary work among the native populations of the Caribbean, where he has encountered unusual challenges to the faith. I pray that his presence will bring peace to your troubled estate." The letter was signed by Bishop Antoine Blanc himself, a man whose reputation for piety and wisdom extended far beyond the borders of Louisiana. Mrs. Henderson felt a surge of hope as she read his words. Perhaps divine intervention would succeed where human efforts had failed. Father Francois Dubois arrived 3 days later, just as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with iron-gray hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent much of his life in tropical climates. His dark eyes held a depth of experience that spoke of encounters with both the sacred and the profane, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced darkness and emerged victorious. The priest's first impression of Magnolia Grove was one of profound spiritual decay. Even before he dismounted from his horse, he could sense the malevolent presence that had taken root in the plantation like a cancer. The very air seemed thick with corruption, and the sweet scent that permeated the grounds reminded him of flowers left too long on a grave. "Mrs. Henderson, I presume," he said, greeting the housekeeper with a slight bow. "I am Father Dubois. Bishop Blanc has sent me to assist with your difficulties." The elderly woman's relief was palpable as she led him toward the big house. "Oh, Father, thank the Lord you've come. We don't know what to do anymore. That thing in the cellar, it's getting stronger every day." As they walked, Mrs. Henderson provided a hurried account of recent events. The strange child's birth, the mysterious deaths, Master Whitmore's breakdown, and finally, the decision to imprison Eliza in the root cellar. Father Dubois listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each detail. "You say the child has been confined for nearly a month?" he asked, as they reached the big house steps. "Yes, Father, but it hasn't helped. If anything, things have gotten worse. The smell, the nightmares, the way the very air feels wrong. We're at our wits' end." Father Dubois nodded thoughtfully. During his years in the Caribbean, he had encountered similar phenomena, entities that fed on human suffering and grew stronger when confined or threatened. The Church had taught him that such beings were manifestations of ancient evils, demons that had found ways to enter the physical world through cracks in reality's foundation. "I will need to examine the child," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute faith. "But first, I must prepare myself through prayer and fasting. Evil of this magnitude cannot be confronted lightly." The priest spent his first evening at Magnolia Grove in the plantation's small chapel, a modest wooden structure that had been built for the spiritual needs of the Whitmore family. As he knelt before the simple altar, Father Dubois could feel the malevolent presence pressing against the sacred space like a tide of darkness held back by invisible barriers. His prayers were interrupted by sounds from the direction of the big house, not the musical laughter that had become Eliza's trademark, but something far more disturbing. It was a sound like singing, but in no language he recognized, with harmonies that seemed to resonate in his very bones. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and utterly alien, as if it had been composed by minds that operated according to entirely different principles than human consciousness. Father Dubois had heard such songs before, in the deep jungles of Haiti, where he had ministered to communities plagued by supernatural forces. They were summoning songs, calls to entities that dwelt in the spaces between worlds. And if his experience was any guide, they were being answered. The next morning brought confirmation of his fears. The household staff reported that strange lights had been seen flickering in the cellar windows throughout the night, and several of them had experienced shared dreams of vast, dark spaces filled with amber eyes and reaching shadows. Most disturbing of all, the heavy wooden door that secured the cellar had begun to show signs of stress, its iron reinforcements groaning under some invisible pressure. "She's calling to something," Mrs. Henderson whispered as she served the priest his breakfast. "Every night that singing gets louder, and every morning we find new things." "What sort of things?" Father Dubois asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Dead animals, arranged in patterns around the house, but not just dead, drained, like something sucked the very life out of them. And the patterns, they hurt to look at, Father. They make your eyes water and your head spin." The priest nodded grimly. He had seen such arrangements before, ritual circles designed to focus and amplify supernatural energies. If the entity in the cellar was indeed creating these patterns, it suggested a level of intelligence and purpose that made it far more dangerous than a simple demonic manifestation. After breakfast, Father Dubois made his way to the slave quarters to speak with Sarah, the child's mother. He found her in a state of profound grief, her eyes red from weeping and her body weakened by weeks of anguish. The other slaves had rallied around her, providing what comfort they could, but it was clear that her suffering was taking a terrible toll. "They took my baby," she whispered when the priest introduced himself. "They say she's evil, that she ain't natural, but she's my child, my flesh and blood." Father Dubois studied the young woman's face, seeing in her features the same pale complexion and unusual bone structure that Mrs. Henderson had described in her daughter. There was something otherworldly about Sarah's appearance, though it was far more subtle than what he expected to find in the child. "Tell me about Eliza's birth," he said gently. "Was there anything unusual about the circumstances?" Sarah's account matched what he had already heard, but the priest detected nuances that others had missed. The storm that had raged during the birth, the circle of dead rats, the child's immediate awareness. All of these suggested that Eliza's arrival had been more than a simple birth. It had been an emergence, a manifestation of something that had been waiting for the right conditions to enter the physical world. "I want to see her," Sarah said suddenly, her voice gaining strength. "I don't care what they say she is. She's my daughter and I want to see her." "That may not be wise," Father Dubois replied carefully. "If the child has indeed been touched by evil, your presence might only strengthen its hold on this world." But even as he spoke, the priest knew that Sarah's maternal bond with the entity might be the key to understanding and possibly defeating whatever they were dealing with. In his experience, supernatural beings often maintained connections to the circumstances of their manifestation, and those connections could sometimes be exploited. That afternoon, Father Dubois finally descended into the cellar to confront the source of Magnolia Grove's torment. He had prepared himself through hours of prayer and meditation, had blessed his crucifix with holy water from the chapel's font, and had armed himself with the full authority of his faith. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found in that stone chamber. Eliza sat in the center of an intricate pattern that covered the entire floor, her small hands moving with impossible precision as she arranged and rearranged small objects in configurations that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. She had grown visibly during her month of confinement, her features becoming more defined and her presence more commanding, but it was her eyes that truly shocked the priest. They were no longer simply amber. They now held depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical, windows into spaces that existed outside normal reality. And when she turned her gaze toward him, Father Dubois felt as though he were being evaluated by an intelligence that was vast, ancient, and utterly alien. "Hello, priest," Eliza said, her voice carrying impossible clarity for a child barely a year old. "I have been waiting for you." The sound of her words hit Father Dubois like a physical blow, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his very soul. For a moment, his faith wavered, his certainty shaken by the casual ease with which this creature addressed him. But then his training reasserted itself, and he raised his crucifix with steady hands. "I come in the name of Jesus Christ," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "By his power, I command you to reveal your true nature." Eliza's laughter filled the cellar. Not the musical sound that others had described, but something far more terrible. It was the laughter of something that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, that had fed on human suffering since the dawn of consciousness itself. "Your Christ has no power here," she said, her child's voice carrying undertones of infinite malice. "This is my domain now, priest. These are my people, my cattle, my feast." Father Dubois felt the sweet scent that permeated the cellar beginning to affect his senses, felt the familiar wave of euphoric disorientation that seemed to accompany close contact with the entity. But he had faced such influences before, had learned to shield his mind through years of spiritual discipline. "You are a demon," he said, his voice steady despite the supernatural pressure bearing down on him. "A fallen angel cast out from the presence of God. And like all demons, you can be banished." "Demon?" Eliza's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous for a human mouth. "Oh, priest, you understand so little. I am far older than your demons, far more fundamental than your fallen angels. I am hunger itself, the void that exists between heartbeats, the darkness that dwells in the spaces between thoughts." As she spoke, the patterns on the cellar floor began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The stone walls seemed to pulse like living tissue, and the air itself grew thick with malevolent energy. Father Dubois felt his strength beginning to ebb, felt his faith being tested by forces beyond his comprehension. But he pressed on, beginning the ritual of exorcism that had been passed down through generations of priests who had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. His voice rose in Latin phrases that had been spoken in defense of humanity for over 1,000 years, words that carried the accumulated power of countless faithful souls. Eliza's response was immediate and violent. Her laughter became a shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the big house, and the patterns on the floor blazed with light that hurt to look at directly. The sweet scent in the air became overwhelming, and Father Dubois felt his consciousness beginning to fragment under the assault. But still he continued, drawing on reserves of faith that he had built through decades of service to his God. The words of the exorcism poured from his lips like a river of light, each syllable a weapon against the darkness that had taken root in this place. The battle raged for what felt like hours, priest and entity locked in a struggle that transcended the physical world. Father Dubois felt his strength failing, felt the creature's influence seeping into his mind like poison, but he refused to yield, refused to allow this abomination to claim victory over the forces of light. And then, just as his endurance reached its limit, something unexpected happened. From somewhere above, he heard a voice calling out, Sarah's voice filled with maternal anguish and desperate love. "Eliza, baby, please, come back to me." The effect on the entity was immediate and profound. For just a moment, the terrible intelligence behind those amber eyes flickered, replaced by something that might have been confusion or even pain. The patterns on the floor dimmed, and the oppressive atmosphere in the cellar lightened slightly. Father Dubois seized the opportunity, pouring all of his remaining strength into a final invocation. "By the power of Christ, I banish you from this place. Return to the darkness from whence you came." Eliza's shriek of rage echoed through the cellar like the cry of a damned soul, and the stone walls cracked under the force of her fury. But even as she raged, Father Dubois could see that his words had found their mark. The entity's hold on the physical world was weakening, its connection to this reality growing tenuous. And then, with a sound like reality itself tearing, something fundamental shifted in the cellar. The patterns on the floor crumbled to dust, the sickly light faded, and the oppressive presence that had dominated the space for weeks suddenly lessened. Father Dubois collapsed to his knees, his strength completely spent. But as he looked up at the child, who sat in the center of the ruined patterns, he saw that something had changed. Eliza's eyes, while still amber, no longer held the terrible depths he had witnessed earlier. She looked for the first time since her birth, like an ordinary child. But the priest's relief was short-lived. As he struggled to his feet, preparing to leave the cellar, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. His crucifix, the blessed silver cross that had been his constant companion for over 20 years, was no longer silver. It had turned red. Not the red of rust or corrosion, but the deep, rich red of fresh blood. And as he stared at it in horror, Father Dubois realized that his victory had come at a price he was only beginning to understand. The entity had not been banished, it had simply changed tactics. And somewhere in the darkness above, Sarah's voice continued to call for her daughter, unaware that her maternal love had just provided the creature with exactly what it needed to complete its transformation from supernatural parasite to something far more dangerous. The real horror was about to begin. Dawn broke over Magnolia Grove on December 21st, 1862, the winter solstice, though few on the plantation understood the significance of that ancient turning point. The sun rose, blood red, through the morning mist, casting long shadows across fields that had once been green with cotton, but now lay barren and twisted, as if the very earth had been poisoned by the events of the past months. Father Dubois had been missing for 3 days. The priest's disappearance had been discovered when Mrs. Henderson went to check on him after he failed to appear for morning prayers. His room was empty, his belongings undisturbed, but the cellar door stood wide open, the heavy wooden barrier that had confined Eliza now hanging from its hinges like a broken jaw. The cellar itself was empty, save for a single object lying in the center of the stone floor, Father Dubois' crucifix, now stained a deep crimson that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. No one dared to touch it, and it remained there like a monument to failed faith, a testament to the inadequacy of human understanding when confronted with forces beyond comprehension. Eliza was gone. In the 3 days since her disappearance, the plantation had descended into chaos. The remaining slaves huddled in their cabins, afraid to venture out after dark, while the few white overseers who hadn't already fled barricaded themselves in the big house. Strange sounds echoed across the grounds at night, not the musical laughter that had become Eliza's signature, but something far more disturbing. The sound of many voices singing in harmony, as if a choir of the damned had taken up residence in the shadows. Sarah had been the first to see her daughter after the escape. She had been awakened in the pre-dawn hours by the sound of familiar laughter drifting through her cabin window. When she looked outside, she found Eliza standing in the center of the slave quarters, no longer the infant she had been, but transformed into something that retained the child's appearance while radiating an authority that made the very air around her shimmer with power. "Mama," Eliza had said, her voice carrying across the distance with impossible clarity, "I've missed you." But when Sarah ran toward her daughter, arms outstretched in maternal joy, she found herself unable to approach. Some invisible barrier seemed to surround the child, a field of energy that repelled human contact while drawing in other forms of life. As Sarah watched in growing horror, small animals began to emerge from the darkness. Rats, birds, insects, even larger creatures like raccoons and possums, all moving with the same purposeful gait toward the waiting child. They died as they reached her, their life force draining away in moments, but their deaths were not the end. Instead, their bodies began to move again, animated by some force that had nothing to do with natural life. They arranged themselves around Eliza in complex patterns, their empty eyes reflecting the amber glow that now emanated from her transformed form. "What have you become?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with grief and terror. Eliza's smile was both loving and terrible. "I've become what I was always meant to be, Mama. What this place needed me to be." As the child spoke, more figures began to emerge from the shadows. The slaves who had died during the fever outbreak months earlier, their small bodies moving with the same unnatural purpose as the animals. They were led by little Moses, the first victim, his face bearing the same blissful expression he had worn in death. "They're with me now," Eliza explained, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining a simple concept to a beloved but slow child, all of them. "They understand what I can offer, freedom from pain, from fear, from the endless suffering of existence." Sarah backed away, her maternal instincts warring with her growing understanding of what her daughter had become. "This isn't freedom, baby. This is something else." "Is it?" Eliza tilted her head, and for a moment she looked almost human again. "Look around you, Mama. Look at this place, at what they've done to us, to our people. The whips, the chains, the endless labor under the burning sun. Is that life? Or is it just another form of death?" As if summoned by her words, more figures began to appear. Not just the dead children, but adult slaves who had perished over the years from overwork, disease, and brutality. They moved with the same purposeful gait, their faces bearing expressions of profound peace that was somehow more terrifying than any grimace of pain. "I can end it all," Eliza continued, her amber eyes blazing with inner fire. "The suffering, the oppression, the endless cycle of cruelty that defines this place. All I ask is that you trust me, as you did when I was small and helpless." But Sarah had seen enough. Whatever love she felt for her daughter was overwhelmed by her recognition of the monstrous intelligence that now inhabited the child's form. This was not salvation, it was damnation wearing the mask of mercy. "No," she whispered, then louder. "No, you're not my daughter anymore. My daughter died in that cellar, and you're something else wearing her face." Eliza's expression didn't change, but the temperature around them seemed to drop several degrees. "I am disappointed, Mama, but not surprised. The living always cling to their suffering, even when offered release." The child raised one small hand, and Sarah felt an invisible force seize her, lifting her from the ground with effortless ease. For a moment, she hung suspended in the air, staring down into amber eyes that held depths beyond human comprehension. "But you will understand in time," Eliza said softly. "When the pain becomes too much to bear, when the weight of existence crushes your spirit, you will call for me, and I will answer." Sarah was released, falling to the ground with bone-jarring force. When she looked up, Eliza and her retinue of the dead had vanished, leaving only the sweet scent of corruption hanging in the air like a promise of things to come. The next 2 days passed in a haze of mounting terror. The dead continued to appear throughout the plantation, not just former slaves, but Confederate soldiers who had died in nearby battles, Union troops who had fallen during raids, even wild animals that had perished in the surrounding swamps. All of them moved with the same purposeful gait, all bore the same expression of blissful peace, and all seemed to be gathering for some ultimate purpose. The living inhabitants of Magnolia Grove found themselves trapped in an increasingly surreal nightmare. Food spoiled within hours of being prepared, water turned brackish and undrinkable, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. Those who tried to flee found their way blocked by walls of the walking dead, who made no aggressive moves but simply stood in silent vigil, their empty eyes reflecting the amber glow that had become Eliza's signature. It was Pike, the nervous young overseer, who finally broke under the strain. On the morning of the solstice, he was found in the big house parlor, his body unmarked, but his mind completely shattered. He sat in Master Whitmore's favorite chair, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much, his lips moving in constant whispered conversation with invisible companions. "She's coming," he repeated over and over, his voice barely audible. "She's coming for all of us. The feast is about to begin." Mrs. Henderson, the last remaining member of the household staff, tried to question him about what he had seen, but Pike's responses made no sense. He spoke of vast spaces filled with amber light, of choirs singing songs that predated human language, of a presence so vast and hungry that it made the physical world seem like a shadow cast by something infinitely more real. "The child was just the beginning," he whispered, his eyes focusing on the housekeeper with sudden clarity. "A seed planted in fertile ground, but now she's grown and the harvest is ready." As if summoned by his words, the sound of singing began to drift across the plantation, not the discordant harmony they had heard in previous nights, but something far more organized and purposeful. It was a hymn of sorts, though sung in no earthly language, with harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. Mrs. Henderson rushed to the parlor window and looked out across the grounds. What she saw there would haunt her dreams for the remainder of her life, however long that might be. The dead had gathered in the fields surrounding the big house, hundreds of them arranged in concentric circles that extended as far as the eye could see. They stood perfectly still, their faces turned toward the rising sun, their voices raised in that terrible, beautiful song. At the center of the formation stood Eliza, no longer appearing as a child, but as something that wore childhood like an ill-fitting garment. She had grown during the night, her form stretching and changing until she stood nearly 6 feet tall, her silver blonde hair flowing around her like liquid light. Her amber eyes blazed with the intensity of twin suns, and her pale skin seemed to glow with an inner radiance that made her appear almost translucent. But it was her smile that truly terrified the watching housekeeper, an expression of such profound satisfaction that it spoke of hungers finally being fed, of plans long in the making finally coming to fruition. As the sun climbed higher, the singing grew louder, more complex. The dead began to move, not toward the big house, but in intricate patterns that seemed to mirror the geometric designs Eliza had favored since her birth. They danced, if such a word could be applied to the movements of corpses, their steps perfectly synchronized, despite the obvious decay that marked many of their forms. And with each movement, each note of their impossible song, the very fabric of reality seemed to grow thinner. The air shimmered like heat waves, and through the distortions, Mrs. Henderson caught glimpses of something else, vast spaces filled with amber light, populated by forms that defied description, realms where the normal laws of physics held no sway. "She's opening a door," Pike whispered from his chair, his voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "A door between worlds, and when it's fully open..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Mrs. Henderson could see for herself what was happening. The plantation, the surrounding countryside, perhaps the entire world, was about to be transformed into something else. A feeding ground for entities that existed beyond human comprehension. The singing reached a crescendo as the sun reached its zenith, and the air around Eliza began to tear like fabric. Through the growing rift, shapes began to emerge, things that might once have been human, but had been changed by exposure to forces beyond mortal understanding. They moved with the same purposeful gait as the dead, but their forms were fluid, shifting, as if they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Mrs. Henderson felt her sanity beginning to fray as she watched the impossible parade of horrors emerging from the tear in reality. But even as her mind recoiled from what she was seeing, she found herself unable to look away. There was a terrible beauty to the scene, a cosmic significance that spoke to something deep in the human psyche, the recognition that they were witnessing the end of one age and the beginning of another. The last thing she saw before her consciousness finally snapped was Eliza turning toward the big house, her amber eyes meeting the housekeeper's gaze across the impossible distance. The child, the thing that had once been a child, smiled and raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a farewell. And then the world ended. Not with fire or flood, not with war or pestilence, but with a transformation so fundamental that the very concept of existence was redefined. The plantation, the slaves, the masters, the land itself, all of it was absorbed into something larger, something that existed according to rules that predated human civilization. When the Confederate patrol found Magnolia Grove 3 days later, they discovered a scene that defied rational explanation. The plantation buildings stood intact, but they were empty of all human life. The fields were covered with strange patterns burned into the earth, geometric designs that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. At the center of the main pattern, they found a single object, a child's dress made of the rough cloth typically worn by slave children, but stained with something that might have been blood or might have been something else entirely. It was the only evidence that anyone had ever lived there at all. The patrol's report was filed and promptly buried in Confederate archives, marked as the ravings of men driven mad by the stresses of war. But those who read it in later years would note certain details that seem to echo other reports from across the South. Stories of plantations found empty, of strange patterns burned into fields, of children born with amber eyes who brought death and transformation in their wake. The war would end, the South would fall, and the institution of slavery would be abolished. But in certain remote corners of Louisiana, in places where the old plantations once stood, locals still report strange phenomena on the anniversary of the winter solstice. They speak of singing that drifts across empty fields, of lights that dance in patterns that hurt to perceive, and of a sweet scent that carries on the wind, the scent of flowers left too long on a grave. And sometimes on the clearest nights when the moon is dark and the stars seem unusually bright, they claim to see her, a figure standing in the ruins of what was once Magnolia Grove, no longer a child, but something vast and terrible, wearing the memory of childhood like a discarded skin. She is waiting, they say, waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right confluence of suffering and desperation to open the door once again. Because the feast that began on that December morning in 1862 was never truly finished, it was only postponed, deferred to a time when the world would be ready for the transformation she offers. The little slave girl who science could not explain had become something that transcended explanation entirely. She had become hunger itself, the void between heartbeats, the darkness that dwells in the spaces between thoughts. And she was patient. She had all the time in the world. The sun set over the empty fields of what had once been Magnolia Grove, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to echo the blood that had once fed the cotton plants. And in the gathering darkness, something that might have been laughter drifted on the wind, musical, terrible, and filled with the promise of feasts yet to come. The story was over, but the hunger remained, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl.